The next talk is by Dr. William Stewart from the University of Glasgow. He is a keynote speaker at tomorrow's 6th Annual Concussion Research Symposium. Dr. Stewart leads an internationally regarded research laboratory in Glasgow. He is investigating the pathology of people who have major brain injuries, but also those who have repetitive concussions. He also has experimental models of concussion up and running in his laboratory. He acts as an expert advisor to multiple sports organizations and governments, and his work has contributed to the Scottish concussion guidelines for amateur sports in Scotland. So obviously, William has a major interest in prevention. So please come and give us a message from Scotland.
Thank you for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to come and speak at a meeting like this. I think this is such a great opportunity to share some of our current understanding with a wider audience. I've been challenged with the title, The Brain Effects of Repetitive Concussions. I say challenged for two reasons. One, that's a challenging title to rise to. Secondly, I only found out about this yesterday, so this is, which was organisationally perfect, because I was travelling for some time to get here, and as Charles said, I arrived about 20 minutes before I gave the last talk. So, but I have put this together, so let's see where we go. The challenge, I guess, is to speak to something where I think we all feel we know the answer. The consequences of repetitive concussions are all over the media. New York Times devotes a whole website to the latest research from last year, suggesting that almost inevitably participation in certain forms of contact sport will lead to degenerative brain disease. 110 out of 111 NFL brains examined had degenerative brain disease in them, 99%. So by definition, just by stepping on an NFL field, you are destined to degenerative brain disease if you read these headlines. But of course, the truth is much more complex than those headlines. And to be honest, that story of repetitive brain injury and the risks it may have has been around for some time. This is quite sensitive. That relates to NFL. Now, we just had really powerful testimony about the consequences of repetitive concussion. And I hadn't realised that we were going to hear at this stage, and as I've left this in, this is that video playing out as one player in one match in rugby a couple of years ago. One player in one match. The reason I have this up here, and the reason I'm talking about rugby is more my kind of game. We don't really have football, as you know it, in the UK. We have rugby. Just before I go on, that last concussion, he went off for a few minutes and came back and played on. Later in the game, he's knocked out again and still carries on. Rugby is more my kind of game. It's played widely. It's played widely in Canada, and we'll come back to that. It's played widely in the UK, but what we've got is some really good data from rugby in England, who've kept a longitudinal survey of injuries over the past 14 years or so. And what they've shown is that year on year, the incidence of concussion has been rising, certainly over the past 5 years, to the point now where there are 20.9 concussions per 1,000 player hours. What does that mean? It means that for every match in rugby, there's guaranteed one of the players will go off with a brain injury. Okay, every match. Now you say, well, surely American football is just as bad. Well, actually, it's very difficult to do comparative data because you guys measure things differently. But if we do some translation of data, American football incidence of concussion is lower. Boxing's incidence of concussion is lower. So rugby has a concussion, a brain injury level, now in professional sport, which is higher than American football, higher than boxing. Impact rate, same as American football. Impact severity, same as American football. Brain injury, higher. So if there's a guarantee that when you step onto an American football field, you will develop degenerative brain disease, surely the same must apply to rugby. And so this has obviously got the attention of people within the media in the UK and also as in research, with headlines such as rugby sleepwalking its way into trouble over management of head injuries and concussion. The chap here is Jeff Cross, who's a former Scottish prop internationalist, just retired a couple of seasons ago. He's lost a lot of hair and quite a bit of bulk and is now a doctor just across the road from me. And he was interviewed recently for something we were doing and asking for more to be done. And this chap here, he's a rugby player. You may not know that because he's next to somebody who looks ridiculously small next to him. Cameron Pearce is actually a Canadian rugby player, internationalist, and has become a good friend in recent years. And just to make sure you knew which is which, I'm the one carrying the rugby ball. He's carrying a brain just to confuse people even more. So it concerns us in rugby. What is it that's concerning us? Well, it's this chronic traumatic encephalopathy. We've heard it discussed already. This partly distinctive degenerative brain disease, shortened to CTE, because I can only say encephalopathy once before I trip. I did it twice there. And it seems to be a particular deposition of a protein called tau, which we normally recognise in people with, used to normally recognise in people with Alzheimer's disease and other degenerations, but here we're seeing it depositing in the brain as this brown material. And we met as a group of pathologists, that's Anne McKee from Boston, who I'm sure you all know, about 3 years ago in the spring, to come up with a consensus as to what we felt CTE was, what it looked like. But it's important to note that consensus was based on just 10 cases. Only 10 cases formed a consensus for what we feel this pathology is. Alzheimer's disease, thousands upon thousands of cases, and we're still refining what Alzheimer's disease is. So at this stage, as a consensus, as a population of pathologists, we're basing this on just 10 cases. And as I've said, rugby is a particularly high impact sport, particularly high brain injury sport. So if we believe what we see in other sports like American football, we should see chronic traumatic encephalopathy in CTE in rugby players. And lo and behold, if we go looking for it, we can find it. And this is the index case in rugby, which is a few years ago now. It was an Irish rugby player, amateur rugby, because professional rugby really only took hold in the mid-90s. So anybody who's getting towards the dementia age group, the 50s plus, is largely from the amateur era. But he had a typical pattern of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. That's perhaps not a surprise, you'd say, because surely with the impact and injuries, that we would expect to see that. But one of the questions that I hear repeatedly, and that those of us in the field encounter frequently, is what proof is that CTE is linked to brain injury? How do you know brain injury leads to degenerative brain disease? I'm a great fan of Twitter, and so I asked this on a poll because that's where you get all your best data from. And it's still running, so you know, at the end of this, I expect some more participation. But when I just looked at it there, the choice was, does TBI alter risk of dementia? Yes, no, more data needed. Simple. To my surprise, 49% say yes, 49% say more data needed, and 2% say no. And I think I know who those 2% are. But what about this question? Is it brain injury or something else? Well, here are the circumstances where CTE, or dementia pugilistica, as it was formerly known, had been described. In every one of them, the common denominator is exposure to some form of brain impact or brain injury. Okay, now I dare say there were people in there who were taking alcohol, smoking, misbehaving in other ways, but not to the same extent, and certainly not to the same levels. So I don't accept that this is something other than brain injury. Brain injury is the only common denominator in all the cases we've seen so far, undoubtedly modified by something else, lifestyle, genetics, but let's just look at the facts. Brain injury is the only common denominator so far. So brain injury is not good. Actually, I'm diverting and I'm probably going to take 30 seconds here, but on parachute, one of my collaborators in the UK, Professor Jill Pell, who's an epidemiologist, public health, she challenged with this about observational data, was really getting tired of it. So produced a short article for a British medical journal along the lines of, effectively, there's no scientific data that prove parachutes save lives. There's never been a randomized control study. It's all observational. And her end line in that was, but if anybody wishes to prove me wrong, then they could be the first out the plane. And I think it's that line with brain injury. You know, to me, it makes perfect sense. Brain injury damages the brain. It's an injury. And so why wouldn't cumulative brain injury cause long-term problems? And if we have to wait for longitudinal data to prove that point, we've waited too long. Okay, but let me just reinforce, though, that our understanding of this degenerative brain disease, 10 cases define the pathology that we go looking for now in our diagnostic archives, but the world's literature is limited to only 350, 400 cases, spanning all the way back to the first clinical descriptions of the punch-drunk syndrome about 90 years ago. So in 90 years, much of it in the last decade or so, we've only really seen enough cases to be able to say that this condition exists and that it is strongly linked to dementia, to brain injury. In terms of rugby, just come back to this is recent experience in rugby. This is just a handful of cases I threw together just for the purposes of this talk. I think we're finding something slightly different to what's being reported elsewhere, is that in our 4 cases of rugby, and this is the same for soccer and various other sports that we've looked at, we find that 2 were pure CTE, nothing else, just pure CTE. One was CTE and also had a heavy Alzheimer's disease burden, and one I would have said was a heavy Alzheimer's disease, and that's a primary diagnosis with some CTE in the background. So nothing's as straightforward as that there's one diagnosis covers everything. And I do wonder where in American football all the patients with Alzheimer's disease have gone. Why do we not hear about them? Anyway, the pathology is difficult enough. Let's look at something else. So we've done a study looking at retired international rugby players to try and see if we can pick up this brain that's not functioning very well. We asked them some really, really challenging questions, really refined questions on function to see how their brain was working. And in all the tests we did, all we could find was that they had some problems with fine motor control, so putting pins in a board. And they had some very subtle problems with memory. Nothing they complained of, nothing clinical. So nothing clinical that would suggest they had degenerative brain disease evolving. But this is patients, former players who volunteered, and this is against matched population controls. What we did find, though, very importantly, was the cardiovascular disease rates were considerably lower in the former athletes than they were in the control population. So to me, this says there's probably something going on in the brains, but it's very subtle, but there's a hell of a lot of benefit in participating in sport. So let's not throw everything out with one risk. That, interestingly, was reported as only mild memory effects in concussion. I think largely suggesting that it wasn't good enough. The press wanted us to find more. Mild wasn't good enough. I'll skip over that. I just want to come to this very last slide, because I think this is quite important. We have been campaigning, and I mentioned briefly about the Scottish success, for some years to try and get national recognition for concussion management across sport nationally. Scotland has been successful, but the UK has lagged behind. And earlier this week, my long journey, we were in Westminster at a parliamentary, all-party parliamentary group, and for the first time, English rugby, who really run rugby in the Northern Hemisphere, agreed that more needed to be done in concussion education and management, and that's a real success for us. Because if we can get England to come on board with what we've done in Scotland, which is basically having one message on management for every single sport, which is agreed across every sport and government agency, then I think we'll go a long way. And the reason that we have, I think, succeeded so well in Scotland is because we have our own bad experience. Sometimes I think it takes terrible experience to actually focus people's attention. And Benjamin Robinson was a young lad who, age 14, was participating in a rugby match and had 4 concussions in the space of one match and didn't unfortunately stand up for the last one and passed away. So that's driven us to make sure we produce some sort of change in Scotland. Thank you.